Love is usually a beautiful thing, but when feelings change, emotions can run high. A person who once lifted your spirits can feel like a weight around your neck, especially if someone new has appeared on the scene. In today's compilation, we explore several cases where love soured and turned to murder. We begin with the story of a woman who may have escaped punishment, but who couldn't escape her guilt. Alma Marie Kellner was born in 1883 to an influential family in Pittsburgh, but spent much of her early life in Canada. A gifted musician from a young age, she pursued her passion for the arts and eventually became a talented pianist, playing with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. Her upbringing in Canada was one of privilege, a drastic difference from the chaotic personal life she would later lead. In 1914, Alma married for the first time to Caledon Robert John Radcliffe Dolling, a relative of the Earl of Caledon. Their marriage coincided with the outbreak of the First World War, and her beau soon found himself serving in the military, initially stationed in Prince Rupert, British Columbia. There, Alma also found herself involved in the war effort, entertaining troops with her music. The couple moved to England in 1915 when Caledon was posted to France. While he fought in the front lines, Alma worked at the War Office, dedicating herself to the effort in her own way. Her husband's bravery earned him the Military Cross, but their time together was tragically cut short when Caledon was killed in action during the First Battle of the Somme in 1916. Devastated by her husband's death, Alma threw herself into war service, volunteering with the Scottish Women's Hospital, a medical service under the direction of the French Red Cross and based in Royaumont Abbey. She served with distinction in France, and despite being wounded twice, her courage and commitment were recognized as she was presented with the prestigious French Croix de Guerre. After the war, Alma's life took a new turn. In 1918, she began an affair with the married Compton Pakenham, which led to his divorce and their subsequent move to the United States. The couple married in 1921 and had a son. Alma taught piano while Compton worked as a lecturer, though his career was based on a false claim of holding a doctorate. The marriage was short-lived and Alma returned to Canada with their son in 1922, formally divorcing Compton in 1925. During this period, she continued to give music lessons and composed music under the pen name Lausanne. While in Vancouver, she met Francis Mawson Rattenbury, a noted architect. Much like with Compton, this relationship began as an affair. In 1923, after meeting Alma, Francis made the decision to leave behind his wife, Florence Eleanor Nunn, whom he married in 1898, along with their grown children, Frank and Mary, for Alma, who was not only twice married, but also nearly 30 years his junior. Francis's treatment of his former wife, Florence, was unnecessarily harsh. He would cut off the heating and lights in their home after his departure, and his brazen display of affection for Alma in public alienated friends and colleagues alike. With their reputation tarnished, the couple felt compelled to leave Vancouver behind. After securing Florence's reluctant agreement to a divorce, Francis and Alma married in 1925. The following year, they returned to Vancouver with Christopher, her son, from her second marriage, hoping that the scandal surrounding them had blown over. But this wasn't the case. With this, the pair decided to start anew across the Atlantic in the English seaside town of Bournemouth. There, in 1928, they welcomed a son, but their marriage became strained, and they began living celibate lives, staying in separate bedrooms on different floors of their home, Villa Madeira. In September of 1934, the Rattenburys hired George Stoner, an 18-year-old chauffeur and handyman, to live with them at the villa. Alma once again lonely and seeking passion, began an affair with the much younger man. Frances, well aware of the relationship, chose to tolerate it rather than confront the pair, but the arrangement wouldn't last and soon it would end in tragedy. On the fateful night of March 24th, 1935, Francis Rattenbury was found unconscious with severe and bloody injuries to his head. Alma, in a state of distress, called for the local doctor, who arrived by taxi to find Rattenbury in a troubling condition. He lay on his bed, blood-soaked sheets wrapped around his head, his trousers missing, while evidence of violence, blood spatters, marked the armchair and carpet in the adjoining drawing room. As the doctor attempted to assess the situation, he faced interruptions from Alma, who appeared disoriented and intoxicated. Despite initial assumptions that Rattenbury had simply suffered an accident, the doctor's further examination revealed clear signs of foul play. An ambulance was called to transport him to a nursing home, where it was confirmed that he had sustained several blows to the head. Alma's behaviour was erratic. She claimed responsibility for the attack, telling the police upon their arrival that she had assaulted her husband. She was soon after sedated by the same doctor who had tended to the wounded man. The next day, when taken to the police station, she maintained her admission, but then later insisted that she had no memory of the events of that night or of signing a confession. Tragically, less than a week after the attack, Francis succumbed to his injuries, and in the aftermath, George Stoner came forward claiming he had struck the now fatal blows with a wooden mallet as the victim slept in a chair. The following day, both Alma and Stoner were arrested and charged with murder at the Bournemouth Magistrates' Court, setting the stage for a sensational trial, the aftermath of which would be filled with twists and turns. Proceedings began at the Old Bailey on May the 27th and captivated the public and the press, drawing attention not only for the grisly nature of the crime, but also for the scandal surrounding Alma's extramarital affair. The courtroom became a stage where her life was dissected and scrutinised, and every detail of her past was laid bare for the jury and spectators. Initially, Frances Rattenbury's death on March the 28th, 1935, was reported as a car accident, but the truth quickly surfaced. He had been brutally killed with a croquet mallet. Witnesses recounted the chaotic scene that followed the murder. Dr. O'Donnell, summoned to the Rattenbury home on the night of the incident, found the architect unconscious, his head bathed in blood, while Alma appeared in a dishevelled state, intoxicated, clutching a glass of whiskey. The trial took a dramatic turn when Alma's statements to police were presented in court. In a chilling admission, she had declared, "I did it deliberately. I would do it again." She described a night of playing cards with her husband, during which he urged her to kill him, as he apparently wanted to die. He then stated she didn't have the guts to do it. With this, she then grabbed a mallet and hit him several times in the head before hiding the weapon outside. She finished by stating, "I would have shot him if I had a gun." Alma's relationship with George Stoner, the 18-year-old chauffeur, only intensified the scandal. During the trial, love letters exchanged between the two were disclosed, painting a portrait of a passionate affair that had begun while Rattenbury was still alive. Alma admitted to having improper relations with Stoner, but claimed her husband was aware of it, attempting to deflect blame. The prosecution painted her as a woman driven by passion, asserting that her relationship with Stoner had been the catalyst for her actions that night. They argued that the murder was premeditated, fueled by jealousy and resentment. Alma's defense team sought to portray her as a victim of circumstance, emphasizing the years of emotional turmoil she had endured in her marriage to Francis. They focused on her wartime service and her efforts to care for her son, attempting to evoke sympathy for a woman who had been pushed to her breaking point. The trial was a media sensation, with headlines detailing every twist and turn, captivating the public. Alma's demeanour on the stand, coupled with her haunting testimony of the events that transpired that night, had readers hooked. In contrast to her earlier statement to police, she stated that George had climbed into her bed and told her he had hurt rats, the pair's nickname for Alma's husband. She said he was insanely jealous and often partook in drug-taking, having a particular penchant for cocaine sandwiches. In the end, the jury was faced with a difficult decision. Was Alma a cold-blooded murderer, or was she a woman driven to desperation by a lifetime of abuse? On May the 30th, Stoner's counsel acknowledged that he had delivered the fatal blow, yet argued that he had been incapable of rational thought due to his substance abuse. On May the 31st, 1935, Alma Rattenbury was acquitted of all charges, while her lover, George Stoner, was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Instead of pleading for his own life, Stoner announced that he was glad that his lover was cleared and would not face the same fate as he. The case stirred public sympathy, especially for Alma, and petitions began to circulate in Britain advocating for Stoner's sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. Still, the constant badgering from the press and the thought of George failing to escape his fate played on her mind. The weight of her actions and the tumultuous relationship that had defined her existence ultimately led her to a tragic decision. Overwhelmed by guilt and consumed by grief, on the morning of June the 4th, she wrote a note which read, in part, "I went downstairs twice that night after Stoner told me, and always, oh God, how can I help this boy? That was the only thought in my bewildered mind, and the whole of England knows the muddle I made of it. This woman, so low, so degraded, really loved Stoner. We both loved each other. Our love was not a filthy thing. It was beautiful. I am at least free to a sense. That is, I hope so, when I take my last walk this morning. Had it been possible to have made a home for my beloved children, I would have stuck it. But what help to boys, having a mother who would always be pointed at as that woman?" With this, she made her way from the nursing home she had been staying at after being found in a state of hysteria, and made her way to the town of Christchurch near Bournemouth. There, around 8 p.m, she walked into the waters of the River Stour, took out an 8-inch knife and plunged it several times into her heart. The next day, the front page of the Vancouver Sun described it as the pathetic end of a dramatic life. Alma Rattenbury, once at the centre of a scandalous trial, had become a symbol of despair and lost hope. She was buried in the same cemetery as her husband. However, even death couldn't put an end to the public's interest in her, as morbid souvenir hunters are said to have stolen flowers from her grave, and Villa Madeira was ransacked. As for Stoner, Alma's death added momentum to calls for his reprieve. It's claimed that some 350,000 people signed a petition asking for as much. After his lover's death, Stoner is said to have written another confession, this time stating he had been innocent all along and that Alma had indeed been the murderer. This had little effect on the eventual outcome of his appeal, but he was eventually granted the reprieve he desperately sought. In all, he would spend some 7 years behind bars before being released to serve in the military during the Second World War. After his release, he married and started a family, settling into a relatively quiet life in and around the Bournemouth area. However, he once again found himself on the wrong side of the law in 1990, when the then 74-year-old was found guilty of abusing a boy. He managed to avoid a prison sentence in part due to his failing health, and 10 years later, George Stoner, passed away on March 24th, 2000, exactly 65 years after the attack at Villa Madeira. As for Francis Rattenbury, despite his significant contributions as an architect, he was laid to rest in an unmarked grave near his home. It wasn't until years later that a headstone was finally put in place to honour his memory, thanks to a family friend, ensuring that his legacy wouldn't be entirely overshadowed by the tragic event of his untimely demise. Our next story explores the life of a socialite whose social status gave her carte blanche to get away with many things, even murder. Today, many gossip sheets are covered in news about the royal family, but in the 1920s, these publications were ruled by a different sort of royalty, the Bright Young Things, a group of rebellious party seekers whose wild antics gave birth to the modern notion of celebrity. Composed mainly of the younger sons and daughters of the aristocracy, the Bright Young Things were known for their flamboyant fashion, decadent parties, and outrageous behaviour. The phenomenon started with aristocratic young female socialites taking to the streets for nighttime treasure hunts, tearing around London on public transportation searching for a prize. Before long, young men had joined in, and the hunt had evolved into high-speed car chases that extended into the English countryside. Eventually, the treasure hunts turned into weekend house parties, theatrical stunts, and fancy dress soirees. The Bright Young Things popularised jazz, introduced slang words like darling, divine, and bogus, and became regular fixtures in the tabloids. Their circle included people like Stephen Tennant, the youngest son of the Earl of Glenconner, who was known for his androgynous style and passionate queer love affairs. Writer Evelyn Waugh, brewery heir Brian Guinness, and extravagant prankster Elizabeth Ponsonby. By the 1930s, Britain was struggling with economic decline and mass unemployment, and the decadent antics of these socialites were no longer seen as aspirational and amusing, but excessive and distasteful. Many of the group went on to be influential novelists, artists, poets, and public figures. Some never stopped their hard partying ways and died of drug and alcohol addiction. And one was charged with a murder so brazen that the ensuing trial served as a symbolic final curtain for the era of the Bright Young Things. Elvira Enid Mullins was born on January 22, 1904 in Chelsea, West London. Elvira, the daughter of stockbroker Sir John Ashley Mullins and Lady Evelyn Maud Adamson, had no shortage of opportunities to find a wealthy husband. But unlike her younger sister, who married a Russian prince, Elvira lingered on the marriage market season after season. Disenchanted with the stuffy world of balls and sporting events, she decided to pursue acting. She attended the Lady Benson's Drama Academy to study under film and stage actress Constance Benson. Elvira landed a small part in Rudolph Frimme's The Blue Kitten, which opened in late 1925 at the Gaiety Theatre and ran for 140 performances. This was a promising start for Elvira, who acted under the stage name Dolores Ashley. However, following her successful run in the show, new roles failed to materialise. Instead, Elvira became swept up in London's high society, on the fringes of the exciting new group, the Bright Young Things. Though not one of the bunch to be followed incessantly by reporters, she was in the mix with characters like powerboat racer Joe Carstairs, antiquarian Edward Gathorne Hardy, and American-born English socialite Ruth Baldwin. She frequented the Bohemian Blue Lantern Club and travelled with her well-heeled friends to Cannes when they wanted a break from dreary London. In 1927, Elvira met American singer John Sterling Barney at a party at her parents' house in Belgrave Square. Barney was part of a music group called the Three New Yorkers, who had residences at the Kit Kat Club and the Café de Paris. In 1928, Elvira reunited with Barney at the Waldorf Astoria in New York and convinced him to accompany her to the family villa in Newport News, Virginia. They were married shortly after, much to the chagrin of Lord Ashley, who was furious Elvira had eschewed the eligible bachelors of the aristocracy for a mediocre American tenor. After returning to England, their marriage quickly soured, and by 1929, John had returned to the States alone. By most accounts, he was a cruel, abusive man, so his absence was likely a welcome change for Elvira. Newly single in every way but the legal one, Elvira quickly rejoined the wilder set of bright young things. She experimented with hard drugs and developed a fondness for fast cars, culminating in a 1930 arrest in Croydon, where she berated the police officer and threatened to get him sacked for daring to arrest the daughter of a knight. In 1931, she purchased the lease of 21 William Mews in Knightsbridge. The choice to live on her own following her separation from John instead of returning to her parents was a rebellious one. An address in the Mews was a statement of belonging to the Bohemian movement, living alongside band leaders and middle-class singletons. Later, the press would point out that Elvira's home was exotically furnished, hinting at a tendency towards excess and illicitness. She was also rumoured to be bisexual and said to engage in frequent sexual activities with various partners at her Mews home. Following a car crash in Piccadilly in 1931 that resulted in a broken jaw, she retired to Paris for a time. There she connected with Michael Scott Stephen, a handsome dress designer from her native England who was currently as unattached and unemployed as herself. History has erased much of Michael's story before meeting Elvira, but we know from statements made by his brother that the Stephen family, a respectable middle-class set, had severed all ties with him, apart from occasional letters from his mother. Without an allowance from his father, Michael turned to gambling to make ends meet. His looks made it easy enough to infiltrate higher social circles, which is how he met Elvira. At the end of 1931, he followed her back to London, moving into 21 William Mews. He functioned as her private secretary and lover, kept in Elvira's enthrall as she promised to expedite her divorce from John Barney. The pair shared a fondness for loud parties, much to the annoyance of their neighbours. More worryingly, they had a tendency to fight viciously and often violently. These two pastimes collided in a deadly drama in the early hours of May the 30th, 1932. Earlier that evening, Elvira and Michael hosted a cocktail party at their home. The soiree was full of recognisable names from the bright young things. After a few rounds of gin and some appetizers, the group disbanded for dinner, with Elvira and Michael heading to the Café de Paris. Later, some of the party met up at the Blue Angel Club. The couple retired to their Mews home in the early hours. Not long after, neighbours heard screaming and shouting from number 21. One neighbour heard someone yell, "Get out! Get out! I will shoot you! I will shoot you!" Seconds later, it seemed the person shouting had followed through with their statement as a pistol shot echoed through the area, followed by a woman's sobs. Michael Scott Stephen died of a gunshot wound around 4:30 a.m., just after Elvira had called her family's doctor and begged him to come at once. When the police were summoned, she reacted with her usual callousness, striking an inspector and calling him a vile swine. She told police that she and Michael had been arguing when he threatened to leave her. She had replied by saying she would kill herself with a revolver if she kept by the bed. A struggle for the weapon ensued and Michael was shot. Though Elvira was released to her parents following questioning, 3 days later, she was arrested and charged with murder. If Elvira had been tried for her crime a few decades earlier, her social status would have likely protected her. But London in the 1930s was no longer enthralled by the elite. Elvira was lambasted as a promiscuous, hard-partying socialite who committed hedonistic acts in her exotically furnished den of depravity. The police had learned that just weeks before Michael's death, a neighbour had witnessed him storming out of Elvira's house. As he walked away, a naked Elvira stuck her head out of a window and shouted, "Laugh, baby, laugh for the last time," as she fired at him with a revolver. Elvira's fate seemed sealed, but she was gifted a powerful ally. Sir Ashley Mullins, with his wealth and connections, was able to persuade the former Attorney General, Sir Patrick Hastings, to represent Elvira in court. Hastings masterfully presented Elvira as an innocent debutante led into a life of sin by the debauched company she kept. With no one to speak for him, Michael was reduced to a series of written statements, most provided by members of the bright young things who'd met him at parties. They remembered Michael as always borrowing money, using drugs and trying to push them on others, and being unable to turn down any gamble. For her part, Elvira never wavered on her version of events that night, and the doctor who'd attended Michael following the shooting testified that she had seemed passionately devoted to the dead man, and that in her mental condition, after the tragedy, she could not have invented the story she told me. At the end of the trial, Hastings gave a closing address that the judge would later say was the best he had ever heard. Hastings cleverly argued that the only evidence presented that pointed to murder was all hearsay. How could a neighbour through the walls of two homes be certain they'd heard someone say, "I'll shoot you," and not just "I'll shoot," or "I'll shoot myself"? He also pointed out that the only piece of physical evidence, the revolver, had been so carelessly handled that by the time fingerprints were taken, the only one clearly defined enough to capture belonged to a detective. There was no way to tell whose finger had been on the trigger when Michael was shot. On July the 6th, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, but London was not ready to acquit Elvira. The press covered the gleeful celebration of her freedom, which reportedly culminated in her shouting on the dance floor at the Café de Paris, "I am the one who shot her lover, so take a good look at me." Even those who believed Elvira could be innocent were less than enchanted by her quick return to the party scene following the tragic death. While the press had largely stopped covering the antics of the bright young things following their wasteful red and white party just after the September 1931 financial crisis, the portrait of excess generated by Elvira's trial was too tempting to resist. Elvira and John Barney's divorce was finalised in 1933. Though given a second chance at a respectable life, Elvira was too deeply devoted to her turbulent lifestyle. Her family essentially disowned her, and she made Paris her primary residence. On Christmas Day 1936, Elvira was found dead in her Parisian hotel room after a long night of drinking and taking cocaine. She was just 31 years old. Elvira Barney's story is a cautionary tale of glamour turned grim, a glittering life brought low by excess and tragedy. Once a darling of the bright young things, she embodied the hedonistic rebellion of a generation desperate to escape the shadow of the First World War. But as the world changed, the antics of London's gilded youth became a symbol of decadence in a time of economic struggle. Elvira's fall from grace is a stark reflection of the collapse of the very culture she once epitomized. Michael Stevens' death, too, reveals the darker side of this glittering world. Like Elvira, he was caught in the destructive cycle of drugs, alcohol, and reckless abandon. But unlike Elvira, he was treated as a cautionary footnote, a man who brought his fate upon himself by associating above his class. He was disowned, unemployed, and lost to the same unrelenting lifestyle that would claim Elvira's life just 4 years later. Their tragic parallels serve as a reminder of the human cost behind the facade of an aspirational lifestyle. Beneath the champagne and scandal, this was a generation often searching for meaning in destruction. In the end, both Elvira and Michael were casualties of the glittering chaos they lived for. Lives burned brightly, but extinguished too soon. Jealous lovers turning to murder is not a new occurrence. Those that took place during the Victorian era seemed particularly dark. Born Mary Eleanor Wheeler in 1866, she grew up in difficult circumstances, shaped by the hardships and the restrictions of her time. The world she entered was one where a woman's future was largely dictated by marriage and propriety. But Mary defied these expectations at nearly every turn. Her early life remains largely obscure, but one detail that is often referred to is that her father was a murderer named Thomas Wheeler. This is likely not the case, however. Historian Sarah Beth Hopton discovered that the newspaper that claimed him to be later published a retraction. Despite this, it's fair to say that Mary had little respect for the law or norms of the time. During her teens, she became involved with John Charles Pearcey, a carpenter, and although they never officially married, the pair cohabited and she took his last name, continuing to use it even after their relationship eventually ended. Mary was not one to be bound by loyalty, and she entertained multiple lovers, making the most of her charm and wit to draw men into her orbit. One of those men she entertained was Frank Hogg, a local furniture remover. He was, by all accounts, a man of weak will and wandering affections, drawn to Mary's intoxicating presence despite being involved with another woman, Phoebe Styles. Unlike Mary, Phoebe was quiet, devoted, and traditional, different in almost every way to her eventual love rival. She would become Mrs. Hogg in 1888 after falling pregnant, Frank marrying her apparently at Mary's urging. In 1889, Phoebe gave birth to a daughter, Phoebe Hanslope Hogg, nicknamed Tiggy. But soon after, she fell ill. Frank seized on an opportunity to have both his lovers under one roof when he employed Pearcey to act as a nurse for his wife and young daughter. It's not known for sure how much Phoebe knew about Frank and Mary's affair, but despite having suspicions they were being intimate, she strove to keep things cordial between herself and the new home help. It's possible she even accepted the infidelity out of resignation rather than approval. But Mary wasn't a person who accepted sharing, at least not for long. Letters later shown at Mary's trial revealed her intense devotion to Frank, professing she could not live without him and that he held unparalleled power over her. She even wrote that she should die if her only friend left her. As the months passed, Frank remained married to Phoebe, never fully committing to Mary. Still, she refused to sever ties and desperately held on to their affair. Whether fueled by love, jealousy, or something far darker, tensions were simmering beneath the surface until one autumn evening, they finally erupted into an act of violence that would shock the nation. On October 24th, 1890, Phoebe received a note from Mary inviting her to tea that afternoon. This wasn't an unusual occurrence given their complicated relationship, and around 3 p.m. she and Tiggy set out for Pearcey's home. However, just an hour later, neighbours reported hearing screams and the sound of breaking glass coming from the property. Later that evening, Phoebe's lifeless body was discovered in Hampstead by a passerby who had initially believed her to be a drunk. She had been discarded on a pile of rubbish. Her bloodied and beaten head, which had nearly been cut off, was covered in a man's sleeveless cardigan. An hour later, a police officer discovered an abandoned baby carriage a mile away in Hamilton Terrace, its cushions and upholstery covered in blood. Authorities speculated the murderer had slaughtered their victim and used the pram to remove the body before abandoning it. This theory was backed up with hair that matched the victim's being found inside the pram and a bolt belonging to it being found near the body. Phoebe's identity was confirmed when her sister-in-law, Clara Hogg, and, perhaps surprisingly, Mary Pearcey visited the Hampstead police station to report her missing. Both sent out by an increasingly worried Frank Hogg. Upon seeing the body, Mary immediately denied it was Phoebe. Clara, who seemed more affected by the gruesome scene, seemed close to agreeing, but hesitated. Pearcey then tried to drag her away, but she managed to ask for the blood on the face to be washed off. With her features made clearer, Clara quickly announced, "Oh, that's her." She and Pearcey then went to Portland Town Station, where Tiggy's baby carriage was recognised, worn and stained with blood. Tiggy's body wouldn't be found until the following morning, when a traveller happened upon her lifeless body in West End Lane. While the tiny corpse did bear signs of violence, an autopsy determined the cause of death was smothering. Suspicion quickly fell on Mary. The victims had been seen entering her home, and by this stage Frank had also been questioned, revealing their affair and, in turn, a motive. Witnesses also claimed to have seen her pushing Tiggy's baby carriage through North London, shrouded in darkness, late on the evening of the murder. A search of her home revealed signs of a violent struggle. Blood spattered across walls and ceiling, stains on a skirt and apron, and matted hair and blood on knives and a fireplace poker. There are a couple of differing stories about Mary's behaviour during the police search. Some reports suggest she sat playing her piano, seemingly unfazed by the investigation unfolding around her. When questioned about the bloodstains, she dismissed them with a peculiar excuse, claiming she had simply been killing mice. However, a report by Constable Edward Mercy states she was instead very nervous during the search, and when officers spotted a broken window, she is said to have told them she broke it catching mice. As for blood spatters, he states she blamed those on a vicious nosebleed. With mounting evidence, authorities formally charged Mary Pearcey with the crime. When she was arrested on October 27, 1890, after being informed of the charges, she simply stated, "You can arrest me if you like. I'm quite willing to go. I think you have made a great mistake." The arresting officer, Inspector Thomas Bannister, asked her to remove her gloves, and when she did so, it revealed that her hands bore cuts and she was wearing a ring belonging to the deceased. While being held ahead of the trial, it's claimed Mary stated to warder Sarah Sawhill that Phoebe had insulted her during tea on the fateful day, and this resulted in a heated argument. However, she stopped short of admitting guilt. Her trial began on December 1st, 1890, at the Old Bailey, drawing significant public attention. The prosecution presented a damning case, emphasising the overwhelming physical evidence found in her home. John Pearcey also came forward to confirm that the cardigan found around the victim's head had been one he had given to Mary. They also focused on the adulterous affair between her and Frank, speculating that this is what had ultimately led her to kill. Despite the mounting evidence, the defendant remained composed throughout the proceedings. Her defence attempted to argue that the prosecution lacked direct proof of her committing the crime, that no one had seen her kill Phoebe Hogg or her infant daughter Tiggy, and that the circumstantial nature of the case left room for doubt. Mary herself did little to aid her own cause. She refused to offer an alternative explanation for the blood in her home, and when asked directly whether she had committed the murders, merely responded, "The answer is no." The jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning with a guilty verdict, and she was sentenced to death. While awaiting her date with the hangman, Mary requested that Frank visit her in prison. He turned this offer down. On the morning of December the 23rd, 1890, Mary was led to the gallows at Newgate Prison. Reports claimed she showed no visible fear as the noose was placed around her neck. With the pull of the lever, she dropped, her life ending. But even in death, her story was far from over. Shortly before her execution, a cryptic personal ad was placed in a Madrid newspaper. Allegedly, at Mary's request, it read, MECP, last wish of MEW, have not betrayed. MEW. What secrets did she take to the grave? Due to the violence used in the murder, newspapers were quick to point to the old bogeyman, Jack the Ripper, speculating on the possibility that Mary may have in fact been Jill the Ripper. This seems highly unlikely, however. As for Frank Hogg, during his wife and daughter's procession from their home to their place of rest, he faced constant abuse and attempts of violence from the crowds who lined the streets, with many seeing him just as responsible for the deaths as his lover. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he didn't remain in the area long. After selling the pram used in the crime to Madame Tussauds for £200, roughly £21,000 today, he moved away, his movements thereafter lost to history. Our next case shows that while new lovers may promise the earth, when a plan for murder goes wrong, they can be quick to change their tune. On the morning of January the 13th, 1928, New Yorkers were met with a shocking sight as they perused the newsstands. The front page of the New York Daily News Extra Edition featured a one-word headline, "Dead." Below was what the news touted as perhaps the most remarkable exclusive picture in the history of criminology. A 32-year-old mother and wife strapped to the electric chair at Sing Sing, her body a blur as electricity coursed through it. It was the first ever photo of an execution by the electric chair, acquired through an elaborate scheme that became one of the biggest coups in newspaper history. The hooded figure fighting for their final breath in that photo was Ruth Snyder, the Manhattan murderess known as Ruthless Ruth. Her crimes and execution would force a nation to reckon with its beliefs about justice, capital punishment, and journalism. Ruth was born May Ruth Brown in Manhattan, New York in 1895. Even in a progressive city like New York, options for women were limited, and Ruth believed she'd achieved the best success she could hope for when she married Albert Snyder in 1915. Albert was 12 years older than Ruth and a successful art editor for Motorboat magazine. The couple settled in a nice home in Queens and had a daughter, Lorraine, in 1918. From the outside, it appeared as though the Snyders were enjoying a quiet, comfortable life together. They hosted friends for dinner, played bridge, and doted on their daughter. But behind closed doors, Ruth and Albert each hid many secrets that would later be revealed in tabloid papers, court documents, and witness testimony. On March the 20th, 1927, 9-year-old Lorraine was roused from her sleep by a frantic rapping upon a wall near to her bedroom. Heart racing, she opened the door to her room to find her mother, Ruth, gagged and bound with cord, lying prone on the floor in front of her. When the youth removed the gag, her mother immediately asked her to fetch a neighbor. With this, Lorraine ran across the road to the home of Louis Mulhauser, who quickly sprang into action. While he loosened Ruth's bonds, she told him, "They hit me over the head and tied me up. I'm afraid for Albert." Inside the main bedroom, Mulhauser found the body of Albert Snyder, bludgeoned and strangled. When the police arrived at the Snyder house, they were confronted with a scene of chaos. Cushions were scattered across the floor, drawers had been yanked open and emptied, and the curtains had been pulled from their rods. According to Ruth, she and Albert had come home late from a bridge party, climbing into bed at around 2 a.m. Shortly after, two large men who apparently looked Italian had broken in and knocked her unconscious. Then they tied her up, killed Albert, and stole her jewellery. This story began to fall apart almost immediately. Ruth had no injuries that corroborated being bashed in the head, and investigators quickly located the missing jewellery stuffed under a mattress, while other valuables had been left untouched. After over 20 hours of questioning, Ruth broke down and offered an explosive confession that shattered the image of the Snyders being a happy family. Not only had she planned to kill her husband, but she'd had help from a secret beau. According to Ruth, she'd hidden her lover, Henry Judd Guay, in the Snyder house early Saturday evening before attending a bridge party at a friend's home with her husband and daughter. After Albert fell asleep that night, Guay emerged from his hiding place and struck his defenseless victim across the head twice before strangling him with a picture wire. After the murder, Guay then set the scene, ransacking the home and tying Ruth up before leaving her to wake Lorraine. While Ruth's story admitted guilt, it placed the blame for the actual murder squarely on Judd Gray's shoulders. So who was her mysterious cohort? Like his lover, Judd was already married and had a child. He'd met Ruth in 1925 when they were introduced by a mutual friend at a restaurant. After some flirting, the pair immediately began an intense affair. Judd's work as a traveling corset salesman provided him plenty of opportunity to meet her in New York, and Albert's long hours at work meant he was rarely home to notice she was missing. Though the couple had both declared themselves madly in love, it didn't take long for them to turn on each other. Judd told police the murder was entirely Ruth's doing, and Ruth insisted Judd had been the mastermind, tweaking her story once more. After her initial confession, Ruth recanted and said Judd had let himself into the Snyder house the night of the murder. She'd begged him not to kill Albert, but he'd insisted. He'd purchased an iron window sash weight, chloroform, and picture wire. He'd stuffed a chloroform-soaked rag into Albert's sleeping mouth and forced Ruth to hit her husband over the head with the sash weight once. Then he'd clubbed Albert 2 more times before strangling him with the wire to make sure he was dead. Judd, on the other hand, said Ruth had been the one to wield the murder weapon. She'd seduced him into buying the chloroform while she supplied the sash weight. He stated he had been so terrified that night he'd landed only a glancing blow with the weight, and it was Ruth who'd smashed Albert over the head until he crumpled to the ground. Judd said he helped Ruth drag her husband into bed and later went back and used the picture wire to ensure the job was done, but he'd been in such a daze that he could hardly remember it. The dramatic tale of love triangles, betrayal, and murder dominated papers in New York and beyond for nearly a year. Over 180 reporters from across the country were tasked with covering the case for their voracious readers. With each passing day, the details seemed to grow ever more grim and salacious. Ruth and Judd had booked a room under the name Mr. and Mrs. Guay at the Waldorf Astoria nearly weekly for 2 years. They decided to run away together but needed to finance their escape. Together, they arranged for Ruth to take out a $45,000 life insurance policy for Albert. The policy carried a double indemnity clause so that if death was caused by misadventure, the payout would be $90,000. Then they'd plotted the murder across the pillows and by letter and telephone. Most of the reporting painted Ruth as a sexual deviant driven to murder by her own madness. She was described as a synthetic blonde murderess, a vampire wife, and as Ruthless Ruth, the Viking ice matron of Queen's Village. On the other hand, Judd Guay was described as a weak-chinned little fellow, and as though he wouldn't hurt a rabbit. Those descriptions suited Judd Gray's defense team just fine. When the pair went to trial, Gray's attorney argued that his client was an upstanding, law-abiding, red-blooded American with a single flaw, a weakness that made him susceptible to evil women like Ruth. Guay was described as a good husband and father who'd been lured into criminal behaviour by his lover. In his opening statement, the defence attorney said Guay was dominated by a cold, heartless, calculating mastermind and master will. He was a helpless mendicant of a designing, deadly, conscienceless, abnormal woman, a human serpent, a human fiend in the guise of a woman. He was in the web, in the abyss. He was dominated. He was commanded. He was driven by this malicious character. He became inveigled and was drawn into this hopeless chasm when reason was gone, when mind was gone, when manhood was gone, and when his mind was absolutely weakened by lust and by passion and by abnormal relations. Ruth's defence team, on the other hand, sought to present her as a devoted mother and obedient housewife who stocked her cellar with homemade preserves and who would never kill the father of her own child. Though the defence never directly presented the argument that Albert Snyder was abusive, there was plenty of evidence that showed he drank 8 to 10 highball cocktails each evening, had beaten both Ruth and Lorraine on several occasions, and had recently purchased a gun and threatened to blow her brains out. Even Judge Guay, who was trying to pin the murder on Ruth, didn't shy away from describing her tumultuous marriage. He testified that she complained bitterly about the way Albert treated her daughter, and that she told Judd she didn't think she could live with him any longer. In 1927, there was no legal concept of domestic abuse, and presenting such an argument would only show the jury that Ruth was an undisciplined wife who'd angered her husband. Today, we can recognize that while the abuse did not justify murder, it potentially gives further insight into the motives behind it. It's also important to note that Ruth was tried before a jury composed entirely of men. When she learned this, she requested a true jury of her peers, saying, "I'm sorry, I believe that women would understand this case better than men." Her request was, of course, denied. On May the 13th, 1927, it was revealed that neither had done enough to escape their fate, as both Ruth Snyder and Judd Guay were found guilty of murder and both sentenced to death. They were taken to Sing Sing's death house to await their date with old Sparky. By then, the case had become the mainstay of tabloid headlines, with papers devoting more space to coverage of the crime and trial than they would to Charles Lindbergh's record-setting solo flight, which took place the same year. Guay granted frequent interviews, eager to endear the public to his plight. He told the Daily News of Ruth, "She would place her face an inch from mine and look deeply into my eyes until I was hers completely. While she hypnotized my mind with her eyes, she would gain control over my body by slapping my cheeks with the palms of her hand." During the trial, thousands swarmed the courthouse each day, hoping to snag a seat. And after Ruth and Judd were marched into Sing Sing as a zealous mob looked on, eager to catch a glimpse of the hypnotic murderess and her weak-chinned former lover. The public interest was driven by an ongoing tabloid press war between New York's biggest newspapers. Bent on outselling each other, they peddled lurid stories heavy on scandalous details and light on truth. Daily News publisher Joseph Medill Patterson had positioned his paper as New York's picture newspaper and relied heavily on photos of notorious criminals and their gruesome handiwork to sell copies. So when Ruth Snyder was scheduled to be the first woman executed in Sing Sing's electric chair in nearly 30 years, Patterson knew he needed to get a photographer in the execution chamber. There was just one problem. New York State had banned cameras from all executions. The guards at Sing Sing's death house were familiar with every newspaper photographer in town, especially after being hounded by them relentlessly during Guay and Snyder's wait and death row. So the Daily News enlisted the help of Tom Howard, a photographer for the Chicago Tribune, which happened to be run by Patterson's cousin. Howard could pose as a journalist to gain access to the execution chamber, but he would still need a way to secretly snap a photograph. The workaround was simple but genius. Howard created a single-use camera that could be strapped to his ankle. Then he ran a cable up his trouser leg that allowed him to open the camera's shutter by squeezing a bulb in his pocket. Howard applied along with 1,500 other reporters to be among the 20 allowed to witness the execution. With his press pass approved and his camera ready, the countdown was on. At 11 o'clock on the night of January the 12th, 1928, hundreds of people gathered at the gates of Sing Sing prison. Even though the executions that night would take place deep within the facility and could not be seen or heard from the gates, morbid onlookers were eager to witness as much as they could. Tom Howard and the 19 other selected reporters had arrived at 10:30 to be prepared by Warden Lewis Laws. Laws told them about Ruth and Judd's final meals, described the last conversations he'd had with them, and explained that Ruth would be executed first. The rules of the execution chamber were simple: no talking, no smoking, no drinking, no leaving. After agreeing, the reporters were led through the prison complex to the back entrance of the death house and into the execution chamber. Howard took a spot in the front row where he'd capture the best shot with his single chance. When Ruth Snyder entered the room, she was so distressed she could hardly walk. Her face was swollen and red from weeping. After attaching the electrodes, she was given a chance to say a few final words. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," she said. Ruth Snyder died the same way she'd been condemned, in a room full of men. No women reporters had been selected to cover the execution. Just after the executioner flipped the switch to send the deadly voltage through Ruth's body, Tom Howard covertly lifted his trouser leg and pressed the bulb in his pocket. He let the shutter remain open for several seconds, then silently eased it shut and dropped his trouser leg into place. After the condemned was declared dead, her body was removed from the chamber and Henry Judd Guay was brought in to meet his own fate. By 11:14, the former lovers were both dead. Tom Howard rushed to a waiting car and hurtled back toward Manhattan to deliver his photo in time to make the morning paper. For his trouble, he was awarded a $100 bonus. When the Daily News hit stands the next day, it sold out within minutes. But not everyone was happy with the gruesome front page. Prison officials were furious that Howard had violated their trust. Executioner Robert Elliott said it was indeed a horrible picture. Even Howard himself grappled with the photo. He later told Collier's magazine, "I am not heartless. This was a grisly business." But the Daily News argued that the death chamber photograph throws light on the vividness of reporting when done by camera instead of a pencil and typewriter. The controversial snap, engineered only to sell papers, ended up serving a larger civic purpose. It forced the public to confront the reality of the electric chair. The modern execution device was a thing of mystery that was seen by only a few. Proponents of its use touted a fast, painless death. Now the nation was able to see the machine in action, carrying out the state-sanctioned killing not of a hardened male mobster, but of a woman wearing a skirt and stockings. It would be another 35 years before executions stopped in New York and hundreds more convicted criminals sat in the electric chair after Ruth Snyder and Judd Guay. But the photo of Ruth, blurred by her writhing as the electricity surged through her, was never far from mind. Her body was interred in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx under a simple stone that reads May R. Ruth and Albert's daughter Lorraine was raised by Ruth's mother, much to the dismay of Albert's surviving family. While on death row at Sing Sing, Ruth requested that her daughter not be brought to the prison. Instead, she wrote Lorraine a letter and asked it to be given to her daughter when she was old enough to understand. Ruth Snyder's story is a grim reminder of how betrayal and desperation can lead to chilling outcomes. Her crime shocked a nation, but it was the haunting photograph of her final moments that cemented her place in history. That single, illicit image captured by a hidden camera forever changed the way the public saw crime and punishment. Ruth's execution became one of the first cases where the media brought the stark reality of the death penalty into people's homes, leaving an unsettling legacy that still resonates today. In the end, Ruth Snyder's case became more than a story of murder. It was a turning point in the relationship between the press, the public, and the criminal justice system. The saying goes that the pen is mightier than the sword, and our next case shows that, depending who puts it to paper, it can also be mightier than the justice system. Today, we embark on a journey into the life of Marguerite Alibert, a woman whose name was whispered through the most scandalous circles of early 20th century Europe. Born into modest beginnings, Marguerite would rise to become a French socialite, a courtesan to royalty, and ultimately a murderer. Her story is entwined with a prince, a philandering husband, and a trial that shook the foundations of both French and British high society. So pull up a chair and let us unravel the events that led this beguiling woman to commit a crime most foul. Marguerite was born in Paris in 1890 into circumstances as unremarkable as they come. Her parents worked laborious jobs, her mother a housekeeper and her father a coachman. But Marguerite, ambitious and headstrong, had no intention of living a life of hardship. Early in her adolescence, she was sent to a convent called the Sisters of Mary, after her parents blamed her for the death of her younger brother. The tragic event being that she was babysitting him when he ran into the street and was hit by a lorry. At the boarding school, Marguerite fell into further hardship as she experienced extensive physical and emotional harm at the hands of the nuns. By the age of 16, her life took another dramatic turn when she became pregnant and gave birth to Raymonde, a baby girl out of wedlock, a scandalous event in itself at the time. She claimed the father was the son of a nobleman. His parents were less than enthused that he had gotten a commoner pregnant and so forbade him from marrying Marguerite. She found herself expelled from the convent and, unable to support the newborn, her parents sent Raymonde away to be raised by a family in the French countryside. With her rocky upbringing behind her, Marguerite soon found herself drawn into the demi-monde of Paris, a realm of courtesans and wealthy men, where she quickly discovered her ability to captivate and manipulate. Her beauty, wit, and ruthless ambition made her stand out, allowing her to cultivate relationships with wealthy suitors who lavished her with luxuries that would have been unimaginable in her earlier years. By 1907, she had fully entered the world of high society sex work, where her lovers were no longer ordinary men, but influential figures of the French elite. One of her most notable affairs was with André Mella, a wine merchant twice her age, who showered her with gifts and large sums of money. For 6 years she lived in opulence, taking Mella's last name and convincing onlookers they were married. Yet despite the wealth, the relationship soured, and Marguerite yearned for more. Her ambition and beauty would soon attract the attention of an even more illustrious client, Edward, Prince of Wales and future King of the United Kingdom. In 1917, during World War I, Marguerite and Edward embarked on a passionate affair while he was stationed in France. Though their romance would last only a year, its consequences would reverberate for decades. The young and impressionable prince was smitten with Marguerite. Their relationship was not merely one of fleeting infatuation, but one fueled by the mutual attraction to excitement and danger. Edward, in particular, was rebelling against the stifling constraints of royal life. During their brief affair, he wrote numerous letters to his lover, pouring his heart into words that, unbeknownst to him, would later become invaluable to Marguerite. He eventually moved on to new lovers, but Marguerite was not the sort to accept her dismissal lightly. She held on to the letters, which contained not only expressions of affection but also sensitive information about the war effort and negative comments about other royal family members. Although Edward attempted to have the letters burned, his confidant was not successful, and Marguerite held onto the bargaining chips tightly. Writing to a friend, Edward put his frustrations into words. "Oh, those bloody letters! How I curse myself now, though only if I can square this case it will be the last one, as she's the only woman I've ever written to." Luckily for him, Marguerite continued to climb the social ladder, eventually marrying an Egyptian prince and putting her ideas of blackmail on the back burner. In 1921, she met and soon married Ali Fahmy Bey, a wealthy Egyptian playboy who frequented the European social scene. Fahmy, though 10 years younger and besotted with Marguerite, had traditional views about marriage, expecting his wife to adopt Egyptian customs, including modest dress and subservience. His new wife, ever the independent and progressive woman, refused to comply, setting the stage for a volatile and unhappy marriage. Ali, perhaps in retaliation for his new wife's refusal to conform, took on other wives, and Marguerite found herself trapped in a marriage without recourse to divorce. The relationship became harmful, with frequent public arguments and physical altercations, causing their friends and enemies to nickname them the Fighting Fahmies. Unbeknownst to high-tiered diplomats, Ali was not actually royal. His father had the respectable title of Bey, meaning governor, so the couple embellished with little white lies and eventually commandeered enough respect to be referred to as Prince and Princess Fahmy. Marguerite's aim was to have the marriage fail quickly with a nice financial payoff. However, the plan failed miserably. While lovers had been jealous in the past, Ali took matters into his own hands, claiming that he could tame the headstrong young woman. In one letter to Marguerite's sister Yvonne, Ali wrote, "Just now I am engaged in training her. Yesterday, to begin with, I did not come in to lunch or to dinner, and I also left her at the theatre. With women, one must act with energy and be severe. No bad habits." The letter was most likely meant to cause a laugh, but also revealed some of the tensions in Ali's mind. It was obvious that he felt like he needed to control his wife. On the 9th of July 1923, while the couple was staying at London's high-profile Savoy Hotel, the tension between them reached a tragic climax. After watching the theatre show The Merry Widow, the pair was seen walking back to the Savoy when a street performer asked Marguerite if she would like to hear some music. To his dismay, she told him she did not, due to the fact that her husband was planning to end her life that night. As they headed back into their hotel room, a particularly vicious argument broke out. At around 2:30 a.m., hotel staff reported hearing gunshots ring out. Entering the Fahmy's room, they discovered Marguerite making no attempt to run after shooting her husband 3 times from behind with a pistol, bullets hitting him in the neck, back and head. Her arrest quickly followed while Ali was rushed to hospital, where he would succumb to his wounds. Marguerite's trial commenced on the 10th of September 1923 at the Old Bailey, one of London's most famous courts. There, before a crowded gallery, she was to face the charge of murder, the gravest of accusations. It was a case like no other, attracting crowds that spilled out onto the streets, clamouring for a glimpse of the courtroom action. The British press, as well as international media, descended upon the proceedings, eager to chronicle every sordid detail. Marguerite's defence was spearheaded by the formidable Sir Edward Marshall Hall, a barrister whose reputation for theatrics and eloquence was well known. He was no stranger to high-profile murder cases, and in Marguerite's defence, he would once again put his considerable skills to the test. The prosecution, meanwhile, was led by Sir Travers Humphreys, an equally accomplished legal mind, tasked with proving that Marguerite had deliberately and premeditatedly killed her husband. The case appeared open and shut, at least on the surface, but as in all such affairs, appearances can be deceiving. Sir Edward aimed to prove his client had acted in self-defence, a victim of repeated abuse at the hands of her tyrannical husband. Her counsel portrayed Ali as a violent man, one who had subjected Marguerite to both physical and psychological cruelty throughout their marriage. A vivid picture emerged of a marriage filled with abuse, one where Ali's controlling nature, exacerbated by his traditional views on a wife's obedience, led to violent outbursts. One of the most damning aspects of the defence's case was Marguerite's claim that Ali had forced her into unnatural intimate acts, an accusation that was considered scandalous in the extreme. Though these allegations shocked the courtroom, they were crucial in framing Marguerite as the victim in the relationship, a woman pushed to the brink by her husband's depravity and entirely out of her depth in Ali's world. They painted her as the quintessential European socialite, ill-suited to the violent temperament and cultural expectations of an Egyptian husband. The prosecution, meanwhile, sought to characterize Marguerite as a manipulative woman, one who had married Ali for his wealth and had ultimately murdered him to rid herself of the man she had grown to despise. Marguerite's testimony was compelling, her demeanour that of a tragic figure who had been driven to desperate measures. Sir Edward Marshall Hall masterfully guided the jury through evidence as sympathy for the defendant rose. But the defence was steeped in unethical behaviour. From discourse regarding a homosexual relationship to racial stereotyping, many of the arguments made in the courtroom were vile comments that would never be allowed in today's modern judicial system. However, looming in the background of this high drama was another, more subtle narrative. The possibility that this trial was not merely about the death of Ali Fahmy Bey, but about protecting the reputation of the future King of England. The infamous letters that not only declared his love for a prostitute, but also indiscreet comments about the prince's family and sensitive military information from the First World War. It is whispered, and with good reason, that the British establishment was eager to see Marguerite acquitted, lest these letters come to light. Indeed, her eventual acquittal on the 15th of September 1923 was seen by many as a foregone conclusion, though the jurors could not have known about the shadow of royal scandal hanging over the case. After just half an hour of deliberation, they returned with their verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause as Marguerite was declared a free woman. Yet for all the public spectacle and the legal manoeuvring, the verdict was not the end of the story. Though Marguerite escaped the gallows, she failed to secure any of her late husband's considerable fortune. Under Egyptian law, she had no claim to his assets, leaving her in a precarious financial situation. Returning to Paris, she attempted to resume her life as a socialite, but her reputation as a murderess and her dwindling finances left her increasingly isolated from the circles she once commanded. The years following the trial were not kind to her. Though she never publicly mentioned the letters again, their shadow loomed over her until her death in 1971. She lived out her remaining years in relative obscurity, a once prominent figure, now a relic of a bygone era. In the twilight of the 20th century, Marguerite's grandson disclosed the existence of a clandestine deal that had been struck during her 1923 murder trial. According to him, a pact was forged behind closed doors involving powerful figures determined to protect the British royal family from scandal. The proof? Marguerite's own words in her private diaries, now in her grandson's possession. The deal, he explained, hinged on one crucial condition. Should Marguerite be acquitted of the murder of her husband, Ali Fahmy Bey, she would agree to destroy all the letters she had received from Edward, Prince of Wales. The fear that these letters might be exposed to the public was too great a risk for the British establishment to bear. So with that, a deal was made. Historians, including Andrew Rose, who delved deeply into the case, have pointed to this revelation as strong evidence that Marguerite's trial was, in many ways, a carefully orchestrated spectacle. Rose, in his thorough research, laid bare the layers of political and personal interests that intersected in this sensational trial, cementing the notion that the law itself had been influenced by forces beyond the court's purview. In many ways, this secret deal echoes the sentiment expressed by Oscar Wilde in The Picture of Dorian Gray. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. While Marguerite yielded to temptation, holding on to those letters for years, the royal family and its allies, fearful of temptation's consequences, sought to erase the potential for public scandal. The destruction of the letters was the final stroke that ensured the veil of secrecy would remain intact. Andrew Rose's revelation reinforced a long-held suspicion that Marguerite's acquittal was not solely the result of a skilled legal defence, but rather a product of deeper machinations designed to preserve the dignity of the British monarchy. Marguerite Alibert's story is a stark reminder of the power dynamics that existed between men, women, the wealthy, the poor, and minorities in the 1920s. Women like Marguerite, who dared to defy societal norms, were often judged harshly. But Marguerite's relationship with Edward undoubtedly shielded her from the worst consequences of her actions. Ali's background as a Middle Eastern man was used against him, regardless of his supposed actions. Marguerite's acquittal was as much a reflection of her shrewdness as it was of the lengths to which the British establishment would go to protect one of its own. It's hard to say that love was involved in our last story. The perpetrator simply wanting someone else and not caring who or indeed how many he had to kill to get them. On Friday, September the 9th, 1949, Flight 108 departed Montreal at 9 a.m, right on time. The Douglas DC-3 made regular runs along the route from Quebec's largest city to the point where the St. Lawrence River widened into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The plane's final destination was a small fishing village named Sept Îles, or 7 Islands, but it would never make it there. After a stop in Quebec City, Flight 108 took off from L'Ancienne Lorette at 10:25, running about 5 minutes behind schedule. On board were 19 passengers and a crew of 4. All souls aboard the regional flight were Canadians, save for 3 American executives from the Kennecott Copper Corporation. The plane would stop next in Baie-Comeau, a paper mill town 220 miles northeast of Quebec. Sometimes the flight would make a flag stop at Forestville, a lumber town halfway between the main locales. But 10 minutes after takeoff, Captain Pierre Laurent was advised by air traffic control that he could skip the stop today. Laurent's acknowledgement of that message would be the last time he was ever heard from. At 10:45, as Flight 108 was cruising in fair weather over the Cap Tourmente National Wildlife Area, a violent explosion aboard the DC-3 shattered the craft and sent its disintegrating remains, along with the passengers on board, spiraling to the earth below. Witnesses on the ground heard what sounded like a crash of thunder and saw white smoke pouring from the plane as it veered sharply north before plummeting into a tree-covered hill. A crew of Canadian National Railway workers working at the base of the bluff were the first to arrive on the scene, climbing for nearly an hour up the 2,000-foot incline to the wreckage. The men expected to find a roaring blaze, or at least smouldering ruins of what was once a shining DC-3. Instead, they discovered no sign of fire, just the shattered remains of an aircraft that had fallen near vertically and the gruesome remains of 23 people. Among the dead were the entire crew, Captain Laurent, a 30-year-old father whose wife was expecting their second child in just a few days, First Officer Gordon Alexander, and Flight Engineer Emile Terrine, each who left wives and children behind, and veteran flight attendant Gertrude Trudy Mackay, who had just returned to work after sick leave. On the passenger manifest were the three American executives, Russ Parker, Earl Stannard, and Arthur Stork, bound for a tour of their company's mining assets. 24-year-old garage station owner Lionel Dallaire, Bank of Montreal inspectors Cecil Humphreys and Alfonso Keller, Ontario Paper Company men Bill Schuler and Ed Cullen, Henri Paul Bouchard with his wife and infant child, Beatrice Philo, a widow visiting relatives, 37-year-old Madame Chapadeau with her infant boy and two teenage children, 14-year-old Florette and 13-year-old Jean-Claude. Madame Durette from Bay Trinité, high school PE teacher Harold Pye, and Madame Rita Gay, en route to collect 2 cases of jewellery in Bay Como. Rescuers and the Quebec Provincial Police combed the wreckage and began the ghastly task of collecting human remains to be carried off the hillside. Though the site of the wreckage was remote, nearly 7 miles of thick forest between it and the nearest highway, it didn't deter reporters, gawkers, and frantic loved ones of those on board from attempting to descend the steep slope to the crash site. Among them was Joseph Albert Gay, who'd driven from Quebec to Cap Tourmente in the hopes of locating his wife, passenger Rita Gay. By the time he arrived, police had established a perimeter around the wreck to keep looters and macabre souvenir hunters away. By the following morning, the crash of Flight 108 was international news. Canadian Pacific Airlines had not had a single passenger fatality in any of its air routes since its formation in 1942, and, fearing potential lawsuits, was eager to determine the cause of the horrific wreck as soon as possible. Their yearning for this information was shared by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Department of Transport, and the Provincial Police. Early on, investigators theorized that the cause of the explosion may have been a defect in the plane's components, but as they found more of the DC-3, this theory was soon ruled out. The bodies of the 4 crew members were autopsied to determine if some mass illness was to blame, but nothing unusual was found. Investigators were further mystified by the presence of a dynamite-like smell at the crash site, despite dynamite not being listed as cargo for the flight. It wouldn't be until the 1970s that civil aircraft became regular targets for hijackings and terrorist attacks, and so while the smell of dynamite at the scene would be seen as a proverbial smoking gun today, this wasn't the case in the 1940s. Analysis of the wreckage determined that the explosion originated in the forward baggage compartment, since the passenger seated closest to the compartment, Henri Paul Bouchard, was blasted nearly 300 feet from the wreckage and not found until September the 16th. Baggage compartment number 1 contained only the luggage and parcels loaded at l'Ancienne Lorette, of which there were only a handful. The cargo manifest for that luggage compartment listed 3 valises, 2 typewriters and 3 Air Express packages. As the investigation unfolded, the loved ones of the passengers and crew set about the grisly business of burying their dead and saying their final goodbyes. Rita Gay's funeral was held at Saint Roch Church, and her grieving husband, Joseph Albert, purchased a 5-foot cross of red roses with a heart of white roses at the centre, bearing the inscription, "From your beloved Albert." Another wreath, bought in his daughter's name, was placed atop Rita's lavish $800 casket. Investigators matched the suitcases and typewriters to passengers who'd made the same flight 2 days earlier, when there was not enough room for all of the baggage. One of the Air Express packages contained automobile parts, another lingerie. The third was a 25-pound parcel, contents unspecified, shipped from Delphine Bouchard of Saint-Simeon to Alfred Plouffe of Baie-Comeau. But investigators found no record of an Alfred Plouffe in Baie-Comeau, and Delphine Bouchard said he knew nothing of the package. The only clue was a witness statement from the baggage clerk at Quebec Airport, who said a nervous, dark-haired woman in her 40s had arrived in a taxi shortly before Flight 108 was scheduled to depart. After dropping off the heavy parcel, the woman departed in the same taxi cab. Using the detailed records of Quebec's taxi drivers, investigators determined that on the morning of September the 9th, only one had made a round trip to the airport with a woman and a package. Driver Paul-Henri Pelletier told investigators that he remembered his passenger well, from the way she'd seemed overly careful with her package, and admonished his driving to her 55-cent tip. Pelletier was able to take investigators to the apartment house where he'd collected the dark-haired woman, and he was able to identify her when she eventually emerged from the building. Her name was Marguerite Pitre, a rough-and-tumble 41-year-old woman who worked on and off as a waitress, took in boarders, and allegedly performed abortions for desperate friends and neighbours. In his impatience to break the story about the mysterious package, taxi driver Paul-Henri Pelletier contacted a reporter at Le Canada, a French-language Montreal paper. While not naming Mrs. Pitre, he told the paper that the police were pursuing a suspect who had delivered a strange package to the airport on the morning of the plane crash. Shortly after, Marguerite Pitre was found semi-conscious at her home following an overdose of sleeping pills. On September 23, the recovered Pitre was questioned by police. She told them she had delivered the package to the airport at the request of Joseph Albert Guay, a close friend who was 9 years her junior and who she considered to be like a son to her. Pitre claimed not to know what was in the package and said she believed it contained some kind of religious statue. Pitre was held on charges of attempting suicide, which was illegal at the time. It would later be revealed that Guay had supplied Mrs. Pitre with the pills, suggesting that she take her life, and full blame for the entire incident. Joseph Albert Guay was having dinner at his mother-in-law's house when he heard the radio broadcast about Mrs. Pitre's arrest. According to his mother-in-law, he stood up, banged his hand on the table and shouted, "Damned slut," before hastily departing for his mother's house in Limoilou. He was arrested the following morning and taken to the Quebec men's jail while the Crown built a case against him. The story that emerged was more horrific than any prosecutor could have imagined. Joseph Albert Guay was born in 1918 and grew up in one of Quebec City's roughest neighborhoods. In this coarse environment, Guay developed into a small-time hustler who took to calling himself J. Albert. During the Second World War, he worked at a government munitions factory while selling watches and jewellery of questionable quality on the side. Every penny he earned went into creating his persona as a suave man about town. He purchased fancy suits and bought himself a Mercury automobile to impress the many eligible young ladies also spending their war years at l'Arsenal de Saint-Malo. It paid off in 1941 when he married a big-eyed brunette named Rita Morel. The newlyweds settled in the lower town section of Quebec, an unsavoury area along the river. Fellow l'Arsenal employee Marguerite Pitre lived nearby and befriended the handsome newlywed who flattered her with his affections. Guay eventually left the Arsenal and became a full-time jewellery salesman, relocating with Rita to Sept-Îles. They had a daughter named Lise in 1945, and Guay supported the small family by travelling up and down the St. Lawrence River, peddling engagement rings, crucifixes and watches. He also collected watches that needed repair, which he sent to Marguerite Pitre's brother, Généreux Ruest, a skilled watchmaker who had a workshop in his apartment. Gay's sales, mostly made on installment plans, didn't generate the sort of income he hoped for. In addition to his financial struggles, Guay was frustrated with Rita's new role as a mother, which consumed all of her time and attention. During a trip to Quebec City in 1947, Guay met a waitress named Marie-Ange Robitaille, and the pair began an illicit affair. Marie-Ange told Guay she was 19, but she was only 17 when they met. And while she knew Guay was married and had a daughter, the pair told her parents he was a young bachelor named Roger Angers. Perhaps desiring to be closer to his new lady, he moved his family back to Lower Town in early 1948 and opened a store there. Between running his business and posing as a devoted husband and father, Guay paid twice-weekly visits to Marie-Ange's family home, pretending to be an earnest suitor courting the Robitaille's young daughter. But the ruse ended in November 1948 when Rita, who'd overheard neighborhood gossip about her husband's teenage girlfriend, showed up at the Robitaille's house and told the young girl's parents the truth. Shortly after Rita's dramatic visit, Marie-Ange contacted Guay and told him she'd been kicked out of her parents' house. Guay asked Marguerite Pitre if she would take in the homeless teen, and Pitre agreed. For months, Marie-Ange pretended to be living in Montreal to keep her parents at bay. By early 1949, she was tired of being kept in the shadows and decided to finally end the affair and return home. According to her, Guay got wind of her plan and held her against her will, biting her face several times in an effort to embarrass her into staying put. In April, Joseph approached a family friend and offered him $500 to kill his wife, suggesting that the would-be assassin poison her with a bottle of cherry wine. The friend turned the offer down, but didn't tell Rita about the plot. In June, she took Lise, moved in with her mother, Mrs. Morel, and got a job waitressing. Shortly after being left by both his wife and mistress, Joseph accosted Marie-Ange at gunpoint and threatened to kill them both. He was arrested and charged with attempted assault with a deadly weapon. But Mrs. Pitre used her Lower Town connections to hire a lawyer who managed to wrangle the charge down to carrying a gun illegally, which required only the payment of a $25 fine. Days later, he convinced Marie-Ange to accompany him to Montreal and then to Sept-Îles to establish a home together. But within a week, the pair were quarreling again, and the young girl left him and returned to Quebec City. Flustered, Joseph believed that the only way to keep hold of her was marriage. But he thought Rita was unlikely to grant him a divorce. and his well-known history of adultery precluded him from being able to sue for one. Instead, he determined that his best course of action was to kill Rita in a way that disguised his involvement completely. After an appropriate period of mourning, he could marry Marie-Ange without tarnishing his reputation. As he had so many times before, he turned to Marguerite Pitre for help. Both Mrs. Pitre and her brother were struggling financially. Marguerite owed Guay $600, which he promised to forgive if she assisted him with his wicked act. Ruest had just learned a woman he'd been casually dating was pregnant, and she wanted some $300 from him to go away quietly. Guay suggested he could pay the woman and agreed to cut 50% off the price of a ring Ruest wanted to buy for another of his lovers. Together, the three hatched a plan. In early August, Joseph Albert Guay took a boat to Bay Como, where he stored 2 suitcases full of jewellery in a warehouse after a failed attempt to sell them. Meanwhile, he moved into Mrs. Morel's house with Rita and Lise, pretending to be a husband desperate for reconciliation with his wife and daughter. Marguerite purchased 20 half-pound sticks of dynamite, 15 detonating caps, and a 30-foot length of fuse under a false name, telling the clerk they were for blasting tree stumps. Ruest put his watchmaking skills to use as he and Guay constructed a timed detonating mechanism using an alarm clock and a dry cell battery. Mrs. Pitre suggested that they enlist the help of a neighbourhood cab driver in their scheme under the guise of a night out. They could place the bomb in the trunk of the taxi, and at some point Joseph and the cab driver could feign car trouble, leaving Rita in the vehicle while they went for help. The taxi driver Mrs. Pitre had in mind was less than enthusiastic about destroying his own cab, so Guay decided to place the explosive on an airplane instead. He convinced Rita to fly to Bay Como and retrieve the 2 suitcases he'd left there. He purchased his wife a round-trip ticket and a $10,000 flight insurance policy, naming himself as beneficiary. Then he instructed Ruest to set the timing device for 10:45 on September the 9th, when the Canadian Pacific flight would be flying over the St. Lawrence River, information he'd quietly collected during his own flight on the same route with Marie-Ange in July. On the morning of the flight, Joseph Albert Guay collected the bomb from Ruest. The men packaged it in brown paper and chose 2 random names for the addresses. Guay then took the bomb to the railway station, where he handed it off to Marguerite. She delivered the bomb to the cargo counter at the airport, while Joseph rushed home to escort Rita to the Château Frontenac, where she hired a taxi to take her the rest of the way to the airport. Guay had counted on Flight 108 crashing into the St. Lawrence River and destroying all traces of the homemade bomb. But because of the plane's late departure, it crashed into the side of Cape Tourmente, creating a crime scene rich with evidence that quickly led investigators first to Marguerite and in turn Joseph Albert Guay. His trial began on February 24, 1950. The defendant only showed emotion when Marie-Ange took the stand and testified that she no longer loved him. Guay was eventually found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. He spent the time before his execution not appealing his own sentence, but ensuring Marguerite Pitre and General Ruest, who'd both testified against him, earned the same punishment. The condemned man penned lengthy statements for use in both trials, each ending in convictions. On January the 12th, 1951, Joseph Albert Guay was hanged at Montreal's Bordeaux Common Jail. Ruest was escorted to the same gallows on July the 24th, 1952, and Marguerite Pitre on January the 9th, 1953. When she became the last woman to ever be hanged in Canada. Up until her death, Petrie maintained her innocence, claiming she knew nothing of Guay's plans and had only agreed to deliver the package because he promised to forgive her debt. Even today, many believe the evidence tying her to the plot was circumstantial at best. 3 days after the last convicted murderer was executed, Canadian Pacific Airways dismantled the long-protected site of the crash and shipped most of the wreckage of Flight 108 to a scrapyard, though there are remnants at the site to this day. The explosion, contrived and carried out by Guay and his accomplices, remained the largest mass murder in Canadian history until 1985, when Air India Flight 182 exploded over the Atlantic Ocean, killing 329 people, 268 of whom were Canadian. The tragic story of Canadian Pacific Flight 108 is a haunting reminder of how far some are willing to go to satisfy their darkest desires. What should have been a routine flight became the scene of a meticulously planned act of betrayal and murder, driven by a need to fulfill a dangerous obsession. Though justice was served, the devastation left in its wake, innocent lives lost, families shattered, and a nation shaken, remains a scar on Canadian history. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.